So the Indian New Deal had really transformed the conduct of American Indian policy. That set of programs and laws had ended, at least for a moment, had ended that crusade to just wipe out native culture. And it had tried to bring economic development to reservations. That the accomplishments of the Indian New Deal never quite lived up to the hope maybe testifies more to the depth of the challenges that those programs faced rather than to a flaw in the actual idea behind it. By 1940, the Indian New Deal had already started to lose momentum. Reservations were still very poor, even with the jobs programs and even with the federal revolving loan system and even with the other monies that Collier had managed to bring in. Collier's opponents in Congress began to try to undo all of the programs, and Collier increasingly found himself on the defensive just as America's entry into World War II brings a whole new set of changes and challenges. So once again, now that the U.S. is in World War II, once again, Native people are facing conscription to fight for a country that they are now considered citizens of, but in many places where they still can't vote and therefore still don't have representation. By the spring of 1941, more than 7,000 Native men had registered for the draft. This is before the attack on Pearl Harbor. This is actually when FDR is not at all sure that we will even have to fight Japan. He's entirely focused on the war in Europe at that time. We haven't gone to war. We haven't declared war, but we're pretty sure we're going to have to. But FDR was still hoping that he wouldn't have to worry about a two-front war. But then, of course, Pearl Harbor did happen in December of 41. And when news of that attack arrived in Indian country, many young men just traveled to the nearest recruitment center and volunteered. The best known group of Native volunteers were several hundred Navajo code talkers. They served mostly in the Pacific. They transmitted radio messages that had been first translated into Navajo and then encoded. So if the Japanese wanted to interpret that, they would first have to figure out a code that was based on a language that nobody in Japan could speak. But the Navajo were not the only code talkers. That's not the only language that was used. Seminole and Muskogee Creek were also, which are quite similar languages, they were also used for code during World War II. Most of the Muskogee code talkers were in the European theater, as opposed to the Navajo code talkers who were mostly in the Pacific theater. But the code talkers were only a small percentage of Native people who participated in the war. More than 21,000 Native men served in the U.S. Army. Almost 2,000 served in the Navy, nearly 1,000 in the Marine Corps, including Ira Hayes, who is probably the most famous Native soldier. Certainly in World War II, and I think he might be the most famous ever to serve in the U.S., specifically military. 200 Native women served in the various women's auxiliaries of the armed forces. So as WACs or as waves, or the WACs were the Women's Army Corps and the waves were the women accepted for voluntary service. They were basically the naval auxiliary. 550 Indian servicemen died in combat, which is a significant percentage of their numbers. Now, most Indian servicemen fought in integrated units, which made their wartime experience very different than what African American soldiers went through. They faced discrimination and segregation in every branch of the military. So, in that sense, the war did quite a bit to assimilate Native people who found themselves fighting and suffering and dying alongside white soldiers. And in addition to those who joined the military, large numbers of Native people left their reservations to work in specifically war production facilities. And through that, they saw different parts of the United States. The soldiers were seeing different parts of the world. And so they're encountering way more white people. And they're learning a lot more about white culture than they had ever seen before. They made friends outside of the reservation. Some Crow veterans who were interviewed as they returned back from the war said that they were coming back as changed men, so that they felt worldly, that they had been, one of them said, brothers in arms with non-Indians. And they had learned more about the world and the United States and what they could be in that process. Now, soldiers find themselves in closer contact with non-Indians than most of them ever had before. But that process was not so powerful that it overwhelmed their traditional cultures. They continued to carry that with them. Frankie Redbone was a Kiowa in the U.S. Army, and he was actually captured at one point. He was in a German prisoner of war camp, and after he survived and came back to the United States at the end of that ordeal, he attributed his survival to this sacred medicine bundle that his mother had insisted he take with him. And he'd been kind of embarrassed and he hadn't really wanted to take it with him, but he did, and he said that that's what got him through. Tribal religious leaders would conduct ceremonies of the young men who are about to go off to war to protect them. Before the Battle of Guadalcanal, Native soldiers on board a landing craft that were sailing toward Guadalcanal performed a war dance. A close contact with white soldiers made many Native people aware of white culture, but it also made them very aware of who they were and the strength that they could draw from that, even while they're building these connections. And it also made soldiers very aware of their shared identity as Indian people, as not just Crow and Kiowa and Cherokee, but as a part of something bigger. Now, not all Native people supported the war unconditionally, though. Like the Seneca, they view the Selective Service Act, the draft, as a threat to their sovereignty. The U.S. recognizes them as citizens. The state of New York does not want to let them vote. And so they say if they don't have the rights of citizens, why should they bear this responsibility? And they also say that if the Seneca go to war, it will be because the Seneca have decided to do that, not because somebody else is going to push them to do it. In October of 1940, so this is well before the U.S. declares war, the president of the Seneca Nation, Wilford Krauss, said that the United States had no right to conscript Seneca young men for military service. He said, according to the treaty that the Seneca had signed with the United States, they are a distinct race, nation, and people who are owning and occupying and governing the lands of their ancestors and cannot be compelled. Now, 1940, John Collier is still the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, and he pledged to support the sovereignty of the Seneca and of any other Native tribe, but he really only wanted to do that to the extent that he could get them to agree with him. Collier was already a little pissed at the Seneca because they had rejected the Indian Reorganization Act, and he didn't really believe that they could legitimately claim exemption from military service. when a federal court in 1942 issued their decision about whether or not the Seneca could be drafted, and said, yes, indeed, the Seneca can, then Seneca defiance kind of came to an end. Collier said that the court ruled that the Selective Service Act is applicable to all Indians regardless of what their treaties had said. To make this okay, to demonstrate their sovereignty, in June of 1942, delegates from all of the 6 tribes that had been the Iroquois Confederacy, they gather to declare war on their own against the Axis powers. They're going to serve, they were going to be drafted anyway. This makes it their decision. The New York Times wrote an article about it, saying that the New World's oldest democracy had gathered to declare that a state of war exists between the forces of freedom on one hand and Germany, Italy, and Japan on the other hand. And so in that way, they were casting the Iroquois decision, they were using it as kind of propaganda, as a symbol that all Americans, regardless of race, support the war effort. But that article missed the really significant point that members of those Iroquois tribes still believed strongly in and still valued their sovereignty, and that they would send their men to fight and die only in wars that they had declared themselves. So members of the Iroquois, the former Iroquois Confederacy, resisted the Selective Service Act as a threat to their sovereignty. Native people in Virginia, many of those tribes wanted to serve. When they registered for selective service or when they attempted to just volunteer outright, the local draft and volunteer boards classified them as colored, which would have required them to serve in segregated armed forces. And the tribes in Virginia, well, they don't want to, nobody wants to serve in a segregated unit. What am I saying? African Americans didn't want to serve in a segregated unit. But the tribes in Virginia do have a way to get out of their designation. They do have a way to get out of being segregated. And that way is to be really racist against African American people. The government of Virginia strongly believed that there had been so much intermixing between people of African descent and people of indigenous descent that there was no meaningful distinction between those two groups. And so they insist that the Rappahannock and the Pamunkey and the Chickahominy people, all of these people who were part of Virginia Indian tribes were essentially black. And so when a draft board in Richmond ordered 3 Rappahannock men to report to an induction station for black soldiers, they refused to do it. And authorities in Virginia arrested them. They were sentenced to 6 months in prison. The Chickahominy Nation looked at that and said, well, okay, we got to make sure this doesn't happen to us. And so the government of Virginia would allow Chickahominy soldiers to serve in white units only after the Chickahominy tribe expelled any member of the tribe who had married a black person, only after the tribe refused to lease any land to black farmers, and only after the tribe prohibited black doctors and preachers from visiting their communities. So in order to serve in integrated units, they had to prove that they were just as racist as their white neighbors. American Indians served in all branches of the armed forces. They also support the war on the home front, and they do so with great devotion. You know, the New Deal programs, like we talked about, that had never really solved the problem of poverty on the reservations. The Great Depression was still going on there, as it was in many other parts of the country. And poverty remained a really intractable problem. Now, the federal government offered relief but couldn't solve the deep structural problems that affected reservations. Funding from the federal government under the New Deal had allowed tribes to repurchase some of the land that they had lost during the allotment era, but it was less than both the tribe and the government. It did less for the tribes than they or the government wanted to do. But when the war came, funding for most of Collier's New Deal programs dried up. But still, Native people tried to support the war effort. They bought war bonds. The war bonds programs came through the reservations. They offered what they could to the government. The Crow tribe gathered up $10,000. I have no idea how they found $10,000 to put together on that reservation. But they sent it to President Roosevelt to use to purchase weapons and ammunitions from the troops. The Santa Clara Pueblo, the Jemez Pueblo, the Santo Domingo Pueblo, in addition to sending 10% of their men into the military, they volunteered to work at the Naval Supply Depot in Utah to help the war effort. So the wartime experience did more to integrate Native people into mainstream U.S. society than any previous governmental policy. And I think what makes that really interesting is it wasn't a forced integration. I mean, that the drafting was, but the vast majority of Indian men who served in the military were not drafted. They were volunteers. So for the 150 plus years that the federal government had attempted to enforce assimilation, it had always been such a slow fight on the U.S. side, and provoked so much resistance on the Native side, as well it should have. But when the opportunity comes to voluntarily work together, that's when we see the speed up of acculturation. Now, it's not an easy moment. Thousands of Native people left their communities during the war for the very first time, as soldiers, as workers in war industries. And some of them leave in massive numbers, like state officials in New York reported in 1942, basically the first year of the war, that nearly all Native people of employable age were at work as a result of the enormous demand for war production labor. Commissioner Collier observed that between 1941 and 43, the population of reservations fell by 15%. People going to serve in the military or work in war production factories. The agents who worked with the Dakota at the Sisseton Reservation, or worked with the Potawatomi, or worked with the Pueblos, all reported that more than a quarter of their tribal populations had relocated to urban areas to get jobs in war industries. Now, before the attack on Pearl Harbor, fewer than 5% of Native people lived in cities. By 1950, nearly 1 in every 5 did. Today, it's more than half. Seneca and other Iroquoian people found jobs in Buffalo and Rochester and Syracuse and some in New York City. They worked for Curtiss Aircraft and Bausch and Lomb and Bethlehem Steel and all of these companies producing necessary material for the troops. Some moved further away. They traveled to industrial centers in the Great Lakes like Chicago and Detroit and Akron. Between 1940 and 1960, the Native population of the Santee Dakota Reservation in Nebraska fell by 65%. Now, the experience of fighting the war and of relocating to take part in the war effort provided Native people with exposure to higher standards of living. And it provided them with an incentive also to organize, to demand full respect as citizens. They stopped reacting to federal policies and became proactive. And there had absolutely been people and organizations that had tried before to be proactive. but never with the level of success that we will see during and after World War II. In 1944, the National Congress of American Indians was founded. And with that organization, Native people could much more effectively shape and influence government policy. Now, in the 1950s and for most of the 1960s, it's going to be a very long, hard slog to do that. But in the late 60s and beyond, the foundation that they lay here in this moment in the war is going to really take off. There were 80 founders of the National Congress of American Indians. They were drawn from more than 50 tribes. Ruth Muskrat Bronson of the Cherokee Nation was one of the founders. Dan Medrano of the Caddo Nation was one of the founders. They drew up a constitution for the NCAI. The purpose of this organization, they said, was to secure to ourselves and our descendants the rights and benefits to which we are entitled under the laws of the United States, to enlighten the public toward a better understanding of the Indian race, to preserve Indian cultural values, to seek an equitable adjustment of tribal affairs, to secure and preserve our rights under our treaties with the United States, and otherwise to promote the common welfare of American Indians. Native people had demonstrated enormous patriotism during the war. They'd fought in the armed forces, that supported the war effort with great determination, they'd committed their resources to defeating the Axis. They allowed American industries to mine their reservations. They allowed the U.S. government to use their land for airfields, for gunnery ranges, for internment camps for Japanese Americans. And so some American policymakers, some U.S. policymakers looked at that and said, well, they're ready to be not Indians now. They have proven themselves ready to stand on their own feet as Americans. They no longer need the BIA. Maybe we can just dismantle all of those programs and they'll just stop being Indian. Many critics of John Collier called for the Indian New Deal to be completely taken apart. Many of his critics felt that the effort to revitalize Native communities was no longer relevant because so many Native people had left the reservations for jobs or for military service. They argued that Native people were ready for full citizenship, they no longer needed to be treated as wards of the federal government, and ought to be out from under the supervision of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. One journalist wrote at the end of the war that Indians lived under conditions of racial segregation. They were subject to special limitations because they were Indian. And he wrote that the reservations were essentially American versions of concentration camps, which he's got that backwards. The concentration camps were actually German versions of Indian reservations. That's where Hitler got the idea for the labor camps in Germany. And this journalist, Armstrong was his name, said that it was time to dismantle the reservations entirely. He said that the Indian New Deal had meant well, but it had moved Native people in the wrong direction. And instead they were ready to, like 100% of Native people are ready to leave their reservations and just not be Indians anymore. World War II brought about many changes to the world and to the United States and to Native people. A whole myriad of new experiences, of new sociocultural experiences emerged among American Indians after the war. 25,000 of them served in the military, about 50,000 worked in ammunition plants and airplane factories and other war industries. And that had convinced federal officials that they were ready and willing to be fully assimilated into the mainstream. So within just a few years after the end of the war, the federal government will enact a twofold federal Indian policy. relocation and termination. Relocation and termination. And there will be some politicians who truly believe this is the best thing. And there are some who are going to cloak their greed for native land and resources in this nice, shiny, humanitarian mask. The same way that some people did during the removal crisis. A termination and relocation was not entirely new concepts. I mean, ever since the United States was first established, federal policy had almost always, tried to assimilate Native people into the dominant society, sometimes by terminating the unique legal rights of Indian people, despite the fact that the Constitution said they're not supposed to do that. Treaties between the United States and tribal groups had authorized relocating people to reservations, especially the treaties in the 1800s. The Dawes Act had been all about assimilation until John Collier became the Commissioner of Indian Affairs and implemented the Indian New Deal to try and revitalize tribal governments and preserve Indian culture. But the interruption caused by World War II and, we'll just say, some anti-Collier sentiment in Congress spawned a change after the war. And this is the termination and relocation era. And bureaucrats try to present it as a sincere policy to alleviate Native people's poor living conditions. Assimilation was the fundamental objective of these policies. And understanding its underlying ideology is necessary for understanding why these policies were carried out the way that they were. The people who supported termination and relocation, they believed, or said they believed, that Native people would benefit from assimilation and that they would enjoy living in cities, living as modern citizens, ceasing to be Indian. They said that reservations didn't have the economic base to support their people, which, I mean, that was absolutely true. And so the politicians said, well, we'll take them off the reservations, we'll relocate them to cities, they can find jobs, they can find better housing there, and then, you know, the few old recalcitrant people who don't want to assimilate and stay on the reservation, you know, now the reservation won't have to support 500 people, now they'll just have to support like 10 grandpas. They said that integration into urban society would liberate Native people from unemployment, poor housing, and malnutrition, and all of the other problems on the reservation. And they interpreted Native participation in World War II as proof that Native people wanted this, even though not a single Native person said they wanted this. Now, this view that American Indians were ready to become assimilated was reinforced by two federal reform measures that played major roles in revising Indian policy. First, in 1947, the Hoover Task Force Commission report advised limiting government involvement in Indian affairs. They talked about the progress that various tribes had made. Now, most of the progress that had been made had come about as a result of the Indian Reorganization Act, and to an extent because of jobs gained during the World War II era. But looking at that report and looking at them talking about the progress made in different Indian communities, that resulted in a recommendation for reducing the Bureau of Indian Affairs. This recommendation said, well, the tribes don't need that much help anymore. So what we're going to do is consolidate BIA offices. We're going to close some of them down. And so we can provide more efficient, streamlined services. And while we're at it, let's close some Indian hospitals and health centers, and let's close some tribal schools too. That'll save the government money. It'll provide more streamlined service. Yeah, anybody who's been in a school system where they've closed the rural schools and bust everybody into the cities, that doesn't always work very well. They also talked about decentralizing the Indian service. That was a chief recommendation here. And that included an outline for how to just discontinue most Indian service programs. And then so the report led to the recommendation. The recommendation became the basis for what's called the Zimmerman Plan. The Zimmerman Plan. Zimmerman was the Assistant Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Collier's gone. Collier resigns in 1945, and this is 47. Under the Zimmerman Plan, the Bureau of Indian Affairs would categorize Indian tribes into 3 groups. And they were basing it on the sort of economic level of the tribes. So you're in 3 groups. The first group are those tribes that have a good economic foundation, they're doing okay, so they are ready for immediate independence. The trust relationship with the United States will be withdrawn. They will no longer be a federally recognized tribe. And they will no longer have access to any BIA services. That's a very tiny group. Hardly anybody qualified for that. Then there's the second group. That's kind of an intermediate group. Their economy is improving, but they still require some assistance before the federal government can withdraw all of its responsibilities. That's also a pretty small group. Then there's the third group, the vast majority of tribes, which need continued assistance. Another major reform that went along with the Zimmerman Plan offered individual tribes millions of dollars as compensation for past violation of their treaties, if a treaty review commission agreed to it. In 1946, Congress passed the Indian Claims Commission Act. The Indian Claims Commission Act. That was established to hear and determine claims against the United States on behalf of any Indian tribe or Indian band, or I think the word they used was any identifiable group of American Indians in the United States or Alaska. So in effect, once and for all, the Indian Claims Commission was supposed to settle the U.S. government's debts with the tribes. And once your tribe or your group had gone through the commission process, once the decision had been made, once payments had been made, then any injustice committed against Indian people would be considered settled and redeemed. Do not bring it up again. By the end of the 1950s, the Claims Commission had reviewed about 125 cases that authorized about $42 million in payouts to various tribes for past violations. But seeing the success of that process, tribes that had been kind of suspicious of it, because we're suspicious of anything the U.S. government wants to do, they do start to file. And so the number of claims that were being filed increased faster than the commission could actually render its decisions. Twice the Claims Commission was granted an extension to try and complete its work, but not all of the filed claims were actually heard. In September of 1978, Congress finally dissolved the Claims Commission. More than 100 claims were still unheard and unresolved. Those ended up being transferred to the U.S. Court of Claims. Indian participation in World War II had nurtured the seeds of termination. which will grow into a reform policy when Congress takes action under advisement from the new Commissioner of Indian Affairs. These bureaucrats had erroneously interpreted Native participation in the war as readiness to stop being Indian. In actuality, after the war, Native veterans, those who served in war production factories, experienced a lot of social upheaval. In joining the military, in getting these jobs in the cities, in reporting to service, many of them had left reservations and rural allotments for the first time in their lives. In the months and years they spent away from their traditional home environments, they do learn to practice the life ways of white culture. They also compromise their traditional values in order to cope with life in the outside world. And they compromise in ways that they're not always comfortable with. And when the war is over, many of them very gladly return to the reservations, despite the poverty, despite the fact that they probably could have a slightly nicer apartment in Chicago than they could have a house on the Pine Ridge Reservation, because those compromises are asking too much of them. And there are also some stories of, any soldier returning from war has a readjustment period. And there was talk on some reservations by the people waiting for their families to return from war, saying that the spirits of dead enemy soldiers had contaminated their family members who were coming back. And so a lot of reservations would hold purification ceremonies to try and decontaminate the returning veterans, to make them whole again. Now what's happening is PTSD, but mainstream white culture didn't have a way to deal with PTSD back then either. Going back to the reservations, going back to the allotments, even for people who desperately wanted to go back, was still, again, a difficult adjustment. Their perspectives on the world have changed, and it's causing kind of a disharmony in their spiritual balance. Well, they have changed, but life on the reservation had remained relatively the same. And there are lots of accounts of maladjustment among veterans, of all races, but certainly among Indian veterans. If you looked at the book review extra credit, one of the books is called Housemaid of Dawn. It's by Inscott Momaday, and it is about the experience of returning home after war. Ceremony by Leslie Silko, I think I put that on the list too. It's a story about Indian veterans returning to the reservation after fighting in the Pacific Theater. And even though those are fiction, they're very much based on people's real situations. Like Ira Hayes, war hero, helped raise the American flag at Iwo Jima, became one of the most celebrated Indians of World War II, probably the most. But trying to piece his life back together after he returned to the Pima Reservation in Arizona was really difficult. He found interacting with people who had not been to war very difficult. And he couldn't really cope with those changes in himself. And so he became an alcoholic, and during a cold night in the mountains of Arizona in January of '55, he died of exposure. The immediate post-war years were extremely difficult for Native people. Scarce jobs on the reservation and in rural communities added to an overwhelmed, overburdened land base, and that could not support the Native population. In some areas of the country, there were also natural disasters that the tribes had to cope with in the immediate aftermath of the war. During the winter of 47-48, There was a blizzard in the Southwest, struck the Navajo reservation. Some people were on the brink of starvation from that. And the media reported what was happening and got a lot of concern for them. And in an effort to help, they said, to help the Navajo and to help their Hopi neighbors, the Secretary of the Interior proposed a program that would, they said, provide both tribes job training, vocational training, and would develop the resources of their reservations. What that program will actually do is remove Navajo and Hopi people from the reservations, will relocate them. And so that will become the first of the relocation programs. President Truman supported that program. He said the basic purpose is to assist the Navajo and other Indians to become healthy and enlightened and self-supporting, able to enjoy the fruits of our democracy. The Navajo-Hopi bill, when it was finally passed, funded a program that was supposed to improve the livelihood and the financial foundation of these two tribes. But it's going to do that by relocating Navajo and Hopi people. Originally, there were 3 cities that they could be sent to. They could go to Los Angeles or to Salt Lake City or to Denver. And once there, the BIA would help them find jobs. And then they wouldn't go home again. That was the plan. In midsummer of 1951, this is supposed to take effect. The first Navajo and Hopi are supposed to be moved off the reservation and relocated to cities and get jobs there. The BIA assigned relocation workers to New Mexico and Arizona, and also to Oklahoma, and Utah and Colorado and California, with the intention of expanding the program beyond what the law actually called for. Within the next year, the Bureau had officially extended the relocation program to all tribes, and they added more cities that people could be sent to. In February of 1952, the first relocatees arrived in Chicago. In 1955, relocation workers processed more than 440 Native people to be transferred to Los Angeles and Denver and Chicago, just to those 3 cities. That's going to expand considerably. To help place the increasing number of relocatees, the Bureau of Indian Affairs will open additional offices in Dallas, Cleveland, Minneapolis, Seattle, Oklahoma City, San Francisco Bay. In the next several months, offices would be established in St. Louis and in San Jose. And by late 54, 6,200 Native people had been relocated from their homes. About half of the relocatees came from South Dakota, Montana, Minnesota, the Northern Plains. The other half came from New Mexico, Arizona, and Oklahoma. Indians were relocated to 20 different states, with Los Angeles and Chicago being the leading urban relocation centers. Now, if you applied for relocation, it was supposed to be a voluntary program. If you applied for relocation, you could list your top 3 cities that you wanted to be sent to. The one that they would choose, well, first, the BIA would make sure that there was a job, that the job placement center in any of your chosen cities had an opening for you. And then they would choose the one that was farthest from your home. So say you're from Muskogee. A lot of people got relocated out of Muskogee. Say you're from Muskogee and you're like, well, I want to be relocated to Tulsa because that's not too far away. And then second choice, Oklahoma City. And third choice, maybe Dallas. That's driving distance. It's not a day trip, but we can do it. And instead, you might end up in Chicago or Los Angeles or San Francisco. And partly that is because that's where more jobs existed. but it's also partly for the same reason that Indian children were taken to Pennsylvania to go to school, because it's harder to return. The farther away you are, the less likely that you'll be able to go back home. And part of the goal of the relocation program is to make sure that you don't go back home, that you don't have an opportunity to stay Indian. You go to the city, you have no way out, you assimilate, you cease to be an Indian. But at first there were a lot of volunteers, a lot of veterans, and people who had worked in war production facilities volunteer pretty readily because they've already been out in mainstream society. They feel more comfortable with their ability to do that. And then their family and friends will kind of follow them. Typically, you would go and make an inquiry with your agent on your reservation. Or if you lived on an allotment, you would go to the local regional office. You had to be at least 18. You had to be in reasonably good health because you had to get a job. And almost all of the jobs that were available to Indian people were manual labor. The officials would check your job skills. They'd check your employment records. They would contact the relocation office in your chosen cities to make sure that there's a job. And they would give you a bus ticket or a train ticket, and a relocation worker was supposed to meet you there when you got to that city. Now, for people who had been to the cities, who'd worked in the factories, or who'd been in the military, that's not a big deal. But for folks who'd never left their reservation before, there weren't buses on the reservations. They've never seen a bus before. And now they got to ride it out to Los Angeles. When you get to your city and your relocation worker meets you, they will give you a check to purchase groceries and bedding and an alarm clock, which most people didn't have, so you had to buy an alarm clock. And normally the BIA would pay for your first month of expenses. They'd pay your rent, and then they'd give you that money for groceries and work clothes and stuff like that. But after that month, you're on your own. Our relocation officers in some places would also provide like counseling, and in some cities they would like try to stay in contact. They would try to continue to help the adjustment process. What city? I think it was Minneapolis, where the relocation workers stayed in contact with folks for like 8 or 9 years after they arrived. In others, once that month was up, you're done. They don't even talk to you anymore. The majority of applicants were young men. Often they would leave their families on the reservation. They would intend to send for their families once they found a job, once they found housing in the cities. Generally, those who had a little bit of higher education would be more successful in making that transition. Government officials assumed that the assimilation process would become easier as more Native people entered the urban mainstream. So they kept up high quotas for processing relocatees, and they, as volunteers start dropping, they really start a hardcore propaganda program to create the false impression of successful urbanization. Unfortunately, that propaganda is going to convince a lot of congressmen that the relocation program is going so well that it doesn't need as much money. And when they cut some of the funding from the relocation program, then that means that the money to help place people in jobs, the money to help them find an apartment, the money to show them how cities work for people who've never seen a taxi, never seen a telephone, never had indoor plumbing, that goes away. And then the relocation ceases to work as well because they don't have the budget for it anymore. Now, Truman's philosophy on desegregation was, Truman was the first president, really, to actually work toward desegregation, not just for Native people, but for African Americans as well. You know, he's the president who, by executive order, desegregated the Army. He called on Congress to pass like a federal anti-lynching law, which we still don't frickin' have. He called on Congress to create a permanent equal employment commission. He called on Congress to outlaw segregation in housing and education. Of course, Congress wouldn't do a goddamn thing about that. But he was the first president to try those things. And he also believes that Native people should have all of the same rights and educational opportunities and employment opportunities as any other American person. And he is going to implement his view of desegregation through the Bureau of Indian Affairs when he appointed Dylan Meyer, M-Y-E-R, as the new Commissioner of Indian Affairs. His putting Meyer in charge was heavily criticized because by that point, Truman becomes president in 1945, Collier resigns. By that point, there have been multiple generations of Native people with college educations. There's been at least 2 generations of Native people who have been working in the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So there are qualified Native men who could be the commissioner of the BIA. And instead, Truman appoints a white man. So there's quite a bit of criticism about this. Now, Meyer was considered a very hardline assimilationist. He was also a very headstrong advocate of getting rid of what he thought of as needless Indian programs. So Meyer is the one who will really work not just to relocate Indian people, but to terminate the trust relationship between the tribes and the federal government in order to assimilate Indians into the mainstream. Meyer is a real horrible person. Dylan Meyer had been the director of the War Relocation Authority during World War II. He is the guy who was responsible for forcibly imprisoning American citizens of Japanese descent into concentration camps during the war. So that's the guy that's now in charge of Indian Affairs. And he operates the BIA in that same fashion. He demanded immediate action in terminating the trust relationships. He demanded immediate reduction in federal Indian services. And he copped a lot of criticism for that, which he absolutely deserved, for trying to so abruptly dissolve the government's responsibilities to Native people. Pro-Indian supporters said that he was misusing his authority and of moving too fast to terminate the federal trust relationship before tribes were ready to support themselves fully. Meyer was referred to as Stalin and Mussolini rolled into one by one reformer. Collier called him a tin-headed dictator. And calls for his removal persisted the entire time that Truman was president. And as soon as Truman was out and Eisenhower became president, then Meyer was replaced with Glenn Emmons. Emmons, E-M-M-O-N-S. Another white dude. Emmons was a banker from Gallup, New Mexico, I think. And again, qualified Native applicants were passed over. There was Harry Belvin, he's Choctaw from Oklahoma. He'd been working in the BIA for his entire adult life. He was actually better educated than Glenn Emmons was. There was Alva Adam Smith, he's Pueblo. He had been in the BIA for a couple of decades at that point. He was passed over too. One senator objected to Emmons' appointment. He asked why there were so many white men from New Mexico who were heading the BIA. Now, Emmons also supports termination, although He's less of a jackass than Meyer. Emmons had a friendly relationship with Indian people in the Southwest. He's from New Mexico. He was familiar with Pueblo culture. He had learned quite a bit about their traditions. And as a banker, he personally knew many Indians, and he had actually sometimes arranged loans for those that the bank considered a poor financial risk. Emmons sincerely believed that termination was the best thing for American Indians if they were going to improve their livelihoods. But he was considered a liberal terminationist. He wants the process to be more gradual so that it would give the tribes an opportunity to exercise economic independence without being completely cut off from like health services and educational services. And he did try, often failed, but did try to prevent exploitation of the tribes. And he did try to provide relocation services as best he could to support them. The change from Truman to Eisenhower, the change from Meyer to Emmons, represents a changing of the guard in politics in general. It is a change from a Democratic to a Republican administration. And that allows relocation to really gain momentum as a moving force behind the termination policy. Throughout the Eisenhower years, even though Emmons is a liberal terminationist and does want it to be done gradually, the relocation program ramps up dramatically. And these two things together really works with Eisenhower's ideology of what it meant to be American. And it also plays into Eisenhower's sort of fiscal policy. The United States ended World War II with very high debt. And when Eisenhower becomes president, he is very conscious of excessive spending. He wants to cut the federal budget. So there's a very acute difference in the philosophy of Truman and Eisenhower on Indian spending. Under the Truman administration, the Indian Claims Commission had been created, and that had authorized large settlements to pay off Indian groups. That had that task force that surveyed Indian communities and had resulted in at least a brief increase in funding for Indian affairs. Now, the Truman administration absolutely laid the groundwork for termination, but it's the Eisenhower administration that will actively prepare tribal groups for the end of government trusteeship and the end of government services as a way to save money for the federal government. During this period, terminationists, politicians who are hardcore in favor of termination, were the leading policymakers for Indian affairs in Congress. They want to end the trust relationship. They want to end federal Indian programs for basically two reasons. First, they said that Native Americans were capable of supporting themselves without government assistance. And second, they said that the Indian programs were just too costly. This is a complicated era, so I think we're going to stop the video and we're going to let termination be its own thing.